And, dude, I hope to see you in Japan. That would be freaking amazing.
Get up with me after this show about DC and Japan.
Heck yeah.
All right. And we're back. This is the What Really Happened show. I'm Ryan Dawson, subbing for Mike Rivero. The number to call in was 800-313-9443. That was Adam Kokesh. He's left the building. I'm very excited. He's may be coming to Japan. If he gets enough donations or can finance it, that would be awesome. I guarantee you the two of us will get a lot more going than just the dance party and the tattoo thing. That's going to be excellent. We have another guest coming on the show, Joshua Blakeney. He'll be here in a few minutes. That's from Press TV. He's doing an MA about 9/11, September 11th terrorist attacks. Josh, actually, he's on now. Are you there?
Yeah, I was just trying to negotiate some coffee with my wife, but here I am.
Right on, right on. What time is it over there where you are?
I'm in Mountain Time, and so it's 5 minutes before 2 p.m.
Okay, a lot better than me. I'm at 5 a.m. or 4:55 in Japan, but I'm pretty awake. I've had enough coffee. I actually had this stuff called Real Gold. It's even better. Anyway, how dare you question the official story of 9/11? You mean you don't believe the government? You think the government would lie? It's not like they've lied about anything else. Anthrax, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya. How dare you?
Yes, it would appear I'm a heretic.
Me too. Well, so you've been doing all these investigations in 9/11. Gosh, where do you even start with something that big? What do you think is the most ridiculous aspect of the official story? It should be like shooting fish in a barrel.
Well, I mean, I think just the notion that asymmetric fires could cause symmetrical collapses, that's one of the most obvious violations of physics. That, the argument that asymmetric fires would kind of create something like we see with Building 7 is beyond belief. And so, I mean, personally, I tend to focus more on the politics of 9/11 because I obviously think there's been a bit of an overemphasis on technical minutiae and
yeah, I think the bigger picture is why it was done and what it led to. I mean, that it was done, I think, especially for this audience, is already sold. I mean, they were preaching to the choir. But getting more into why 9/11 happened, not just the physics of the buildings or the ridiculous narratives of the tapes and the hijackers and all that, and the Israeli security forces saying, hey, we witnessed the transfer of anthrax between Muhammad Atta and Iraq.
Yeah.
But what we had here is essentially something to replace the Cold War as the new justification for this insane amount of military spending and the green light, once again, to create American imperialism abroad and monopolize resources, et cetera, et cetera. We've always moved from that, where there's the war on drugs or the communists, now the terrorists, and now we have a war on a tactic, a war on terrorism, which is unwinnable, undefinable even, like what you would do to win. And most ridiculous to me is trying to terrorize your way out of terrorism.
Well, indeed. I mean, I had a background in the, Israel-Palestine, the Palestine Solidarity movement at my university. In April 2005, I emigrated from the UK to Canada, and by the following year, I had enrolled in a sociology degree at the University of Lethbridge, and I culminated that in 2010. And my mentor and close friend, Professor Anthony Hall.
Josh, we're coming up to the break. I'm sorry, it was real quick. I do want to hear this afterward. Tell us about the PSM and the Palestinian Solidarity Movement right after the break. And welcome back to the What Really Happened show on RBN. Number to call is 800-313-9443. This is Ryan Dawson of War by Deception, subbing for Mike Rivero, and I have Josh Blakeney on the line. And you were talking about the Palestinian Solidarity Movement at your college, and do continue.
Well, I was just adumbrating my history of how I got into the 9/11 studies. So I was studying sociology at university, and I walked into a class called Globalization Since 1492, taught by a professor named Anthony Hall at my university. And so he was actually at that time, I guess that was 2007, he was kind of revisiting the literature on 9/11. He had been a kind of indigenous studies prof previously, and so I think the idea that the colonized people, the Muslim world, got one back on the empire was attractive to him, and so letting go of the official story of 9/11 was difficult for him to do, but he did so. And so as his student, I kind of witnessed him. I took 2 of his classes at university, and he was kind of beginning to show Building 7 and stuff like that in class. And so he shared books such as David Ray Griffin's books and others with me, and we shared links and that's how I got into 9/11 studies. And so when my sociology degree culminated in 2010, he said, "Why don't you do an MA thesis under me? I'll be your supervisor. We can, really get into 9/11 in an academic context, and rather than just, denouncing universities as venues of indoctrination, try to revive universities once good reputations by trying to actually do some serious, academic work within the context of the University of Lethbridge, where I was at." And so by November 2011, I received an email saying, "Congratulations, you've won the Queen Elizabeth II Graduate Scholarship, one of the most prestigious scholarships in Canada, which is predicated on my grades in my undergraduate degree." And so there I was studying 9/11 skeptically with Her Majesty's imprimatur on my graduate. So by the next day, the National Post was assailing me, and the national media made a big deal of this, that the University of Lethbridge student had been given $8,000 to study conspiracy theories. I was being attacked by an individual named Jonathan Kay, the editor of Canada's
Wouldn't
main...
the official story already be a conspiracy theory?
Well, indeed. I mean, I would say that every lawyer, every criminal lawyer, every judge proffers conspiracy theories on a daily basis, because a conspiracy is merely two or more people coming together to plan an illegal act. And so being a conspiracy theorist is nothing to be ashamed of. I'm a proud theorist of conspiracies. I have nothing wrong with, claiming that title. But, so I found my graduate studies suddenly becoming national news. And, it became clear as I got into this that time and time again, the attacks on 9/11 skeptics emanate from individuals who are partisan to the state of Israel, who, when they're not writing hit pieces on the truth movement, are writing apologetics for Israeli foreign policy. And that's what happened with me. This individual, Jonathan Kay, who's now written 2 books. One is entitled Among the Truthers, A Journey Through the Conspiracist Underground of 9/11 Truthers, Birthers, and Vaccine Hysterics. So he tries to conflate
that all together, yeah.
In that book, he seeks to conflate disparate theorists and theories under the rubric of conspiracy theory in order to demonize anyone who's basically skeptical of those in power. He's written another book in his life, so 2 books in his career as a propagandist for aggressive warfare. And that book was written with an individual named Michael Ross, who's a retired Mossad agent. And that book is actually a kind of biography of Michael Ross, who, left Canada in his teens, went to Israel, fell in love with Israel, converted to Judaism, became a Mossad agent, blah, blah, blah. And Jonathan Kay has written a book with him. So it's not a theory that Jonathan Kay's connected to Mossad agents. He's written a book with a Mossad agent. And that Mossad agent, Michael Ross, eventually also started attacking me through my graduate studies, calling my university to try and get statements, because I was writing for Veterans Today and they had the occasional article on the Holocaust. So, they'd call the Dean of Graduate Studies at my university saying, and,
Well, we're coming up on the break again. I'm sorry we get flowing like this, but you are definitely connecting it all. Israel and 9/11. We'll be back after this message. And we're back. This is Ryan Dawson filling in for Mike Rivero of the What Really Happened show on RBN. The number to call is 800-313-9443. And I'm talking with Joshua Blakeney. And please continue. I'm sorry we get abruptly interrupted sometimes, but those who are assaulting you always have connections to this Zionist interest, like this guy, Mr. K. He's written 2 books, and they've been attacking you. I myself, with a film I made several films, but one prominent one, War by Deception, got me attacked by the ADL, which is, of course, a Zionist organization, and 2 Israeli papers, which were just cut and pasting the ADL's baloney. Haaretz later retracted, the Jerusalem Post did not, but I feel your pain, bro. Yes,
well, I think your work probably is one of the reasons I actually know about, Israeli involvement in 9/11, and you're sort of one of those people, a citizens journalist, who actually bothered to do real journalism, realized that it was incumbent upon those of us who believe in truth and justice to do the media's job for them, because they're so compromised and infested with double agents and triple agents, which leaves humanity in a quagmire where we have this kind of lack of truth, this constant mythology. I mean, it's almost like the 9/11 wars are taking us back to the dark ages of kind of religious wars where it's all based on mythology. And I perceive you to be someone who's kind of rooted in enlightenment thought, in reason, logic, evidence. And I think your work's really exceptional, Ryan, and I'm very pleased to be on your radio show today.
Well, I'm just subbing on the radio show, but I am pleased that you enjoyed the work. That makes it worth it to me. If it spawns people like yourself and getting an MA and studying under a professor about 9/11, I mean, that is exactly what we need to happen. And sticking to the facts, because I can't stand some of the crazy that's out there. And Israel was all over 9/11. I mean, you can't get much more condemning than to have vans packed with bombs and getting arrested, or filming the first plane hitting and spotting it out the day before. But that's always missing from the narrative, unfortunately, from a lot of films. Focus, like you said, on the minutia of the buildings falling and all, which is important. But if you want to find out who did it, maybe it was the people with a van packed full of explosives. I don't know,
Well, I mean, the thing is, what the irony is, although the professors in universities are so scared to talk about this because their bank accounts will be denied the funds that they would get if they went along with studying trivial issues, as most academicians do, or actively promoting the prevailing orthodoxy. So professors shy away from this. But when you actually get students in the room, I mean, we have 3-hour classes on a Wednesday night, Professor Hall has, and often he has to go and travel to places, so he leaves me in charge. And I did a whole 3-hour class on Israel's promotion for the war on terror, Israel's involvement in 9/11. And when the class ended at 10 to 9 p.m. at night, I wasn't finished. And I said, well, you're welcome to leave, but anyone who wants to stay can stay. And they, more than half the class stayed on to continue listening to me talking about this. So students, of course, they're open-minded. They have no vested interest, really, in going along with lies that are, ruining their futures. And so
it's the same rhetoric, too, with Iran. I mean, it's so Israeli-centric. And the Iraq War as well. It doesn't benefit the U.S. at all to put sanctions on Iran and to be spouting all this propaganda about Iran. Not one bit. But we are so beholden to AIPAC and the Zionist lobby and power in the press that we are sacrificing our own interests and possibly headed to war with Iran. The same with the propaganda in Syria and Lebanon, all of Israel's enemies. That's what America's following. It's not just 9/11, it's all of it. That is our entire Middle Eastern foreign policy is completely Israeli-centric.
Yeah, even though Naomi Klein has failed abysmally on the 9/11 issue, because of course Naomi Klein wrote the book The Shock Doctrine, but then missed the most obvious example of the shock doctrine being applied, which is of course 9/11. But Naomi Klein, I came across a really good quote in The Guardian, actually, so it's kind of a useful source to cite because it's a good way to convince left gatekeepers and so on. And she said that what happened on, I'm quoting her pretty much verbatim now, what happened on 9/11 was the Likud doctrine previously applied to the Palestinians was picked up by the most powerful nation on earth and applied on a global scale. She says, the Likudization of the world is the real legacy of 9/11. And Naomi Klein actually wrote that in The Guardian. So I think that's a pretty good phrase, the Likudization of the world. In my studies, I really got into, when I began to realize that 9/11 was primarily a Mossad operation, I began to get into, who really had a motive to do this, and why would they do this? And I got into the history of the Likud party, which of course stemmed from the revisionist current of Zionism led by Jabotinsky, who is well quoted as saying, the Jews need to create a Jewish empire in the Middle East. And, obviously Netanyahu is the descendant of that philosophy, that school of thought that rejected the more pragmatist approach to the genocide of Palestine that the Labour Zionists had. And so we see now the kind of Likud party coming to the fore. The Likud party, under Sharon, formulated what many have now called the Sharon doctrine of seeking to destabilize the Middle East and break down the Middle East ensemble into ethno-religious statelets. Actually, many Israeli geostrategic thinkers have compared what Israel should do with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire didn't have a navy; it used pirates to dominate the seas. We see these Somali pirates now off the coast of Africa, and moreover, the Ottoman Empire employed the millet system, which was one of breaking down into confessional statelets, the Middle East. So it was.
I see those the pirate pretext is this thing about controlling the Gulf of Aden, but you're right. Same with all this thing in Yemen. But we've got a caller, Karen, in Toledo or in Ohio, or let's see. Karen, are you there?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Thank you for taking my call. I'm actually just calling in to remind folks and everyone that tomorrow is the United We Win Marathon, which gathers people from all over the world in peaceful noncompliance as we I'll know that in order to stop everything from happening, we need to stop. We need to step back. We need to strike. We need to tell them no more. We're sick of this, and we're not going to let this gang of 535 plus the president tell us what to do, nor the Zionist interests keep flushing us down the toilet, because politics is crap. Criminals run all politics. So Michael has a banner on his program. I want to thank you for all that you do, and RBN as well, and just let people know to tune in tomorrow to UnitedWeWin.me, add their energy, and let's start to turn this around with a real concerted strike.
United We Win tomorrow.
That's it.
Still be today, my time. All right, thanks for the update. Steve in Tampa, you are on the air.
Hello, Ryan. You're doing a great job there. You get some lively discussion going on. Appreciate
I'm glad
that.
to have Josh on the program. We're going to really sling it. You have a question for either of us or a comment?
Well, it was specific. I didn't realize he was still on, but I just, you were mentioning some of the alternative media, and I was wondering what you thought of Press TV. Well, I'm going to ask you and then just hang up. But what you think of Press TV, what you think of RT, and specifically Max Kaiser, because he talks a lot about economics, and I don't know too much about that. So I'm going to call up, hang up and let you... I'm sorry, bud?
Are you asking both of us that question?
Yeah, I just wanted an opinion, that's all.
Hey, Josh, how do you think of Press TV?
Well, I work for Press TV. It's increasingly referred to as the voice of the voiceless, because obviously all the perspectives that are marginalized and eliminated from the mainstream media that usually seeks to, employ celebrity worship in its journalism or outright promotion of wars and of aggression. Sorry, I just got a Skype. I think Press TV is very important because it's illuminating the suppressed perspectives. For example, I just did a report that just went up today on the Press TV site on Reporters File to do with salmon fishers in British Columbia, the Aboriginals who've been catching fish there literally to feed their children. Their children do not eat if they don't catch salmon. The government's now come in and said, you can only catch fish on a Wednesday because the politicians are in the pocket of the fish farm, the fish farm lobby that are owned by white fishermen who don't want these indigenous fishers catching sockeye salmon from the Fraser River and selling it and, having their own indigenous economy. And so those kind of people, they told me straight up, I'm the first journalist that's ever interviewed them. They were in tears because no media person has ever come to them. And so Press TV offers a platform to all those suppressed perspectives to the kind of colonized world. You think that, as white guys from Britain, US, Canada, we're the kind of beneficiaries of colonization. We're the people whose ancestors came and did the colonizing. But for most of the world, they were colonized. Like 70% of humanity were the victims of colonization. Whereas for me, it was like a train coming west from Britain to Canada. For the indigenous peoples around the world, it's usually been like a train hitting them. And I think Press TV is really the voice of the kind of non-aligned movement. In 1955, all the formerly colonized nations in Africa and Asia and elsewhere came together at Bandung in Indonesia in order to form the non-aligned movement because they didn't want to have to choose between the false dichotomy of US-style capitalism and Soviet-style communism. Now, Iran is one of the main protagonists of the non-aligned movement in a contemporary context. And I think that Press TV is largely a media platform for the oppressed and colonized peoples of the world to have a voice. And of course, that also goes on within our Western states where there's, like the 9/11 truth movement. You could say that's a completely suppressed perspective because the mainstream media is controlled by the very people who have a vested interest in covering up the events of 9/11, covering up
certain things too in Canada anyway, and most of Europe. You're not even allowed to talk about certain topics. If you know what I'm saying? And just to get my 2 cents in here, since he asked me as well, obviously, fan of Press TV, I have Josh on the show from Press TV. It's for RT as well, better except for on Russian issues. And there are some shows there that just sort of have been bottoming out recently, but far, far better than our mass media. And that's just mind-blowing to me. If anyone had told me that as a child, that I would be watching Russian TV to counter the propaganda, that just sounded completely backwards, but that's what it's come to. And as for Max Kaiser, well, I'll discuss him and get Josh's opinion after the break. Hey, this is Ryan Dawson filling in for Mike Rivero in my final hour of this stint where I was lucky enough to have a week with a show whatreallyhappened.com on RBN, the Republic Broadcasting Network. The number to call in is 800-313-9443. We can address the Max Kaiser, Josh, and then I have another caller on the line from Florida. Frank, just a second. I'll give my 2 cents first. Max Kaiser, I think he's a bit of a character, a little animated, but sound on economic news. The way he presents it doesn't matter. Everyone's got their own style. I really enjoyed him going off on these banksters about the LIBOR scandal. He was telling it like it is. Yeah, and his voice cracks sometimes, and he's a little wacky now and then, but you know what? It doesn't matter. His information is solid. On economics, anyway. I did not like his attack on Lew Rockwell. I think I was totally against that. But when it comes to economics, there you go. But for my brand, my economists, the ones I like more, men like Jim Rogers and Peter Schiff, Dimitri sometimes, and then Max Kaiser after that. Your opinions, Josh?
One thing I want to say is, you have to always remember that if you're a dissident against the Russian government or a dissident against the Iranian government, you have the whole array of Western media venues, waiting with their doors open to give you a platform to indict those respective governments. And so the fact that Russia Today doesn't talk that much about Russia, and perhaps Press TV doesn't include so many people who are offering criticism or staunch criticism of the Iranian government, it's not really a good argument against them, because they offer a platform to all the other media venues, and if you are actually someone who has a complaint against the Iranian government or the Russian government, you then have CNN and all the rest of the usual suspects welcoming you in to justify their imperialist hegemonic goals. And so I think Max Kaiser, he's pretty good. I mean, I don't know that much about economics, to be honest, because I focus more on the political, what you might call political science and sociology, but I obviously have a basic understanding of economics, and so I find it very useful to watch Max Kaiser's show, because I'm aware of my ignorance on a lot of economic issues, and so I enjoy watching his shows, even though he probably gets this or that point wrong from time to time.
I think that's good too, is he's also bringing the rather kind of dry subject some flavor. Me, I'm such a nerd, I prefer the Jim Rogers style. But Frank in Florida, you're on the air.
Hey guys, thanks for taking my call and everything you guys do. I was just wondering if you guys are familiar with the Oded Yin's plan.
I was going to bring that up, actually, and we had a break. Yeah, Oded Yin's policy papers predated PNAC, actually, and when Josh was talking about Ariel Sharon and the Likud movement, Oded Yin, that's very central, actually, and that verbatim spelled out the war of Iraq and dividing it and around causing sectarian violence. The whole plan is written out, and that was back in 1979. And then reiterated in 81. Before Wolfowitz and all these guys, these second-generation Straussians, Kristol and the Kagans and the rest of them, before they peddled their propaganda and their letters to Clinton and set up the Iraqi National Congress, because Wolfowitz personally recommended Ahmed Chalabi, even back in 1998 when we almost went to war in Iraq. Remember, Clinton bombed them after his impeachment didn't go through. He ended the war immediately. But before all that was Oded Yin. This is the grandfather of the Zionist doctrine that just led to these modern wars.
Yeah, I came across a book when I was, undertook a kind of simple intellectual exercise when I was, getting into my graduate studies, and I Googled books written by Netanyahu, because I don't actually think Netanyahu's a puppet. I think he's from time to time you actually get a politician who actually has a brain and actually does some of the plotting and scheming him or herself. And so I looked up books written by Netanyahu, and I came across this amazing book written by him or edited by him entitled "A Strategy for Israel in the that's the Oded Yinon paper. It was entitled "Terrorism: How the West Can Win." The Strategy for Israel, A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s is the paper written by Oded Yinon. But this book written by Netanyahu was called "Terrorism: How the West Can Win," and it literally is like a manifesto for the war on terror. It's like a blueprint for the war on terror, but written in 1986, because of course one of the big psyops of the Zionists was to try and portray Israel's enemies. Because you could make a case that Israel has an issue with something called Islamic terrorism. The fact that Palestinians might target civilians obviously stems from the fact that their civilians get targeted. But the idea that Israel's threat from Islamic terrorism is actually a threat to people in Britain and Canada and the US. I mean, that's the main psyop of the war on terror, is to try and basically globalize Israel's localized kind of worldview and paradigm, and make Israel's problems the perceived problems of people in the United States and Britain and Australia and Canada, in Western countries. And so this whole notion of like the West, right? Like when we think about what's the West, it's really like the Israelis are really trying to incorporate themselves into the West and extirpate Islam from the West, because anyone who looks at their history of Al-Andalus, Andalusia, knows that Islam is actually very central in the genesis of the West, right? But what Israel has sought to do is to narrow the confines of the West, to make it kind of Judeo-Christian. And so when we see Netanyahu collating these different essays in this book entitled Terrorism, How the West Can Win, it's quite fascinating to see that he's basically trying to make the case that the West has to have a global war on something called international terrorism, right? So it's really, like Naomi Klein said, it's the Likudization of the world. It's globalizing the narrow and localized paradigm of Israel and trying to make us all view the world through Israel's spectacles, when actually, statistically, you're more likely to die in the bath or from lightning than from terrorism in the US. And even the FBI's website has indicated that Islamic terrorism only accounted for 6% of terrorist attacks.
Josh, we're coming up to the break. I hate cutting you off like that, but I'll let you continue afterward, and I got some 2 cents on that too. And we're back. This is Ryan Dawson talking to Joshua Blakeney. And Frank, are you still on the line? I got excited and jumped on Odin Yedin and started answering, but I feel like you had more to say.
Well, no, that's fine. I wanted to get that word out because a lot of the other hosts in alternative media never mentioned that plan, and it seems like they don't either know about it or they're intentionally not covering that. And I'd like to get the word out so that your listeners can kind of Google that and download that before it gets sanitized by the Mossad and other Zionists, which,
I'll just type his name in and write anti-neocons. I've been writing about it for years and made 2 films about it. So, yeah. But I'm glad you brought it up because I actually meant to, and the commercial threw me off, and so it was perfect timing.
Great. That was it.
All right. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you.
Well, Josh, you also got cut off by the break there. If you wanted to continue on what you were explaining, please do, and then I had some more to add.
Well, we're just discussing the origins of the war on terror. I mean, that's actually what my thesis, which I'm still working on, is. That's the rubric under which it's been formulated, the origins of the global war on terror. What were the origins of the global war on terror? Well, we see.
And you're talking about Bibi's book.
Yeah, there was, of course, preceding that, there was the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism in 1979, June 1979. And then I guess that, I kind of view that
That's the same year as one of Odin's papers as well.
Yes, so Oded and so he's a, geostrategic thinker who really laid it out in the most explicit and lucid of ways what's rational from an Israeli point of view to do. And from a Zionist point of view, obviously, their goal all along has been to seek to attain regional hegemony in the Middle East, not allow any competing hegemons to exist in the Middle East. And many would say that runs up against what would be rational from a U.S. national interest, which would be to prop up competing hegemons in order to foment stability in the Middle East, where the Zionists would want instability to weaken and have the Arabs quarreling and feuding. The oil companies and what was often called the Eisenhower Doctrine was always one of trying to police the Middle East in order to create stability. Because if I say, look, Ryan, I've got an oil company, do you want to invest in my oil company? I'm going to go to Rwanda where there's a civil war and all your stuff's all the infrastructure you're investing
Risk blowing up the pipelines and things.
Lost. And likewise, the oil companies people would only want to invest in an oil company if you can guarantee you're taking it to somewhere where there's, a good Arab potentate making sure there's no instability in the region. Now, the Zionists want the complete opposite, which is where the left is often failing by saying that, Israel's just a tool of U.S. imperialism, because actually it's quite obvious that Israel jeopardizes U.S. imperial interests in the Middle East. In international relations,
or even peaceful economic interests as well. I do want to point out, you were talking about Eisenhower. He was the last one when, after the Levant affair, when Israel pulled that false flag stunt in Egypt, and then they ended up getting invaded anyway. The French and the British ganged up. This was all about over the Suez Canal and the Antwerp Dam and yada yada. But my point is, Eisenhower came in and decided, all right, we're going to have peace troops here for the next 10 years. So by the time that went through his court and everything, this is 1957. The troops were there for 10 years. And exactly 5 days after they were removed in 1967, Israel again attacked Egypt immediately as soon as the international forces were gone. And of course, They claim the Egyptians were amassing on their borders. Russian satellite photos prove otherwise. Israel started that war, and that's also when they attacked USS Liberty, which I was talking about at the beginning of the show. So this is this long narrative. There's a timeline of the Middle East on my page, and Josh is elaborating more in detail today, but that's what he means by from Eisenhower. Do continue.
Well, yes, and indeed, of course, you just mentioned the Lavon affair and then the subsequent Suez Canal crisis, as we're taught to call it in the West, and that's what happened, right? I mean, you saw France, Israel, and Britain collaborating, and the U.S. was coming in actually to try and create stability and put Israel in its place, right? And so you see, even from day one, after the creation of Israel, there's this chasm between what would be the national interest of Israel and the national interest of the United States. And so time and time again, these historical occurrences illustrate for us that the U.S. and Israel have divergent interests in the Middle East. Now, the U.S. in international relations, the jargon phrase is, they call it offshore balancing, where the U.S.'s form of imperialism was kind of more benign and more informal, where, if you exclude the Vietnam War and these, the occasional invasions they did, most of the time they intervened indirectly by propping up local compradors, local puppets. And that, if you ask, I asked Webster Tarpley this when I was with him the other day. I was saying, you're saying what's going on in the Middle East, there's post 9/11 interventionism and social engineering in the Middle East. You're saying this is just an extension of U.S. Cold War policy. But I said, how many countries did the U.S. invade in the Middle East in the Cold War? The Middle East is obviously the jewel in the crown of the American empire. I said, how many countries did they intervene in overtly? And they did it, right? It was Gulf War #1, which George Bush Sr.
Well, that guy just is an apologist. He doesn't want to mention Israel in any aspect about 9/11. I do want to point out, before I forget, the Lavon affair, and I'm not a fan of Pincus Lavon, but he was actually set up, the defense minister that's been named after, or Operation Susanna, if you want to call it that. But it was actually Colonel Benjamin Gavilli who set up and forged his signature. He signed Lavon's signature to get the rest of them in on that. And then of course, bomb went prematurely off in Philip Mason's jacket, and then they unraveled the whole thing. But it wasn't really Lavon. So just getting that out. We should probably start calling it the Benjamin Gavilli affair, maybe, or Operation Susanna. But that's just a little, I just want to stay on track with the truth there about Lavon. But you're so right in what you were saying. And how many did they invade in the Middle East during the Cold War? Didn't. It was mostly focused on Central America and just using the excuse of communism to go steal resources.
But even in Latin America, it was usually death squads, right? Like, it's usually the U.S. controlled the world. They call it offshore balancing. A good example is, so the U.S. wants stability, right? So Hitler emerges in World War II, creates instability in Europe. So then you see the Lend-Lease agreement, right, where they're starting to fund Britain in order to create stability again in Europe. The U.S. is there because it's a global empire. And I mean, this is the way it's always been, is global empires have wanted stability, and you get local elites who don't really like being treated merely as one vested interest and seeing the empire collaborating with the natives. I mean, I'm someone who, I don't really romanticize the American Revolution. If you actually look at the history of the American Revolution, it's quite similar to the Zionists kind of trying to secede from the American empire and control the Middle East, where you had a global British empire who was doing dealings with the Native Americans, was putting the white sort of manifest destiny, we're God's chosen people types in the 13 colonies in their place. And they didn't like that. They didn't like King George doing dealings with the natives. The reason they had to do taxation without representation was because they had to put this huge military down the western flank of the 13 colonies in order to prevent these crazed settlers from going in and killing all the Indians. If you even look in the Declaration of Independence, you see King George did bring on the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is the undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Likewise, in South Africa, the Afrikaners, they disdained the British doing dealings with the blacks, trying to give the blacks some limited rights. If you read Nelson Mandela's autobiography, you see he says, oh yeah, I could go to university under the British system, because the British system was historically mercantilist. They wanted to develop the mother country of Britain, and therefore it was rational not to develop and industrialize in the colonies, but rather to do dealings with the natives, try and co-opt the natives, and you get these local white elites who don't like it. Similarly, in the American empire, they've been doing dealings with these Arab leaders who are, that's fine if you're in an oil company ensconced in Houston and Dallas, but if you're in Tel Aviv, that's disastrous, because these Arab strongmen who get funded and armed by these oil companies in order to create stability in the region invariably sponsor the Palestinian resistance, as Saddam Hussein is, and moreover may even turn the weapons on the Israeli cuckoo in the nest, as Saddam Hussein did in 1991, where he fired 31 Scud missiles at Israel. And there's many even saying that George Bush Sr., even and the U.S. Foreign policy establishment, even egged on Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait in the Cold War, invade Kuwait, and didn't want to actually go and extirpate.
The first Gulf War, yeah.
Because Kuwait has a relationship to Iraq, as Northern Ireland does to Ireland. It was carved out by imperialists, and therefore for Iraq to invade Kuwait and try to reincorporate it into the greater Iraqi state, it would be like the Republic of Ireland invading. And
Saddam, too, had support the whole time from the time he was exiled to Egypt on. They wanted the Baathists to push out what they saw as those favoring the communists in the USSR. And so he, prior to that, so this is back in the 60s, so he puts him in there, right after the revolution in Iran. Suddenly, Saddam's in charge. The CIA supported boy Baathists in Iraq, and almost immediately they go to war for the next 8 years.
Yes, and so it becomes obvious that it's all right for the U.S., they're sitting in Houston, Dallas, Washington, New York, to be propping up these Arab strongmen. But if you're in Israel, it's pretty disastrous. And so yet again you see, and so I view 9/11 as largely an attempt by Israel to seek to align the U.S. with Israeli foreign policy, Likudnik foreign policy, at a time where it was going to be rational after the Cold War is over. I mean, you could make a case in the Cold War Israel did something for the Americans in the sense that they both had a convergence of interests in suppressing Arab nationalism, Baathist, or sort of the genuine elements of Arab socialism or Arab pan-Arabist thought. Of course, the U.S. doesn't have a vested interest in having its own Arab potentates, its own stooges, but destabilized. They would prefer them to be buttressed. And so Israel obviously has a vested interest in there being no hegemons, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Assad in Syria, no competing hegemons, or even in Iran. Whereas the U.S. would, of course, want hegemons in the region as long as it was...
And this is explicitly spelled out in their own policy papers. We mentioned Odin Yinon, and we mentioned BB, and I mentioned PNAC, but also Richard Pearl, if you want to talk about Syria, in the Israeli strategic papers themselves, ISSPA, he's writing the Israeli clean break papers about first rolling back Saddam Hussein, what they have to do first. As Pat Buchanan said, the road to Damascus leads through Baghdad. And then going after Syria. And he explained explicitly how to do it, this Free Syrian Army tactic, all these different groups, Sunni groups, etc., which they would spice up from Jordan, Lebanon, and surrounding areas and involving Turkey. This is all spelled out in policy papers written by Israeli Zionists. Pearl, of course, was in the Defense Department, head of policy, and all involved in the lies that ran up to Iraq as well. But in all of their think tanks, they openly admit this. It's like a modern Mein Kampf. You don't have to speculate about it. They're telling you exactly what Josh is saying about destabilization, factional infighting. It's all spelled out in black and white. But they are just banking on people. They're not worried about it. They're not going to read, so they're not worried about it at all.
Well, and then, of course, you look at South Africa, that's analogous to the dilemmas and the predicaments that the Zionists would have had after the Cold War. When the white apartheid state in South Africa, when it was expedient for the United States to support it, offer vetoes at its behest in the United Nations and help it, to suppress African self-determination in countries like Angola and that in the Cold War, it was expedient for the U.S. to do so. But when it became embarrassing for the U.S. to be supporting a reactionary state in South Africa, they abandoned them and cast them adrift. And I think the Zionists were probably realizing that whereas in the Cold War, there was some kind of modus vivendi, some...
Well, everyone abandoned South Africa except for one little country, and that was Israel. And they benefited greatly where everyone else has got this embargo and doesn't want to trade with them to try and end apartheid. Israel continues to do so. But if you're the only one, if you're the only market left, you can make bank, and that's what they did. They completely exploited them and continued to financially support an apartheid system. But, of course, they have their own apartheid in Israel with the Palestinians.
Well, indeed, and so I think what 9/11 was about was the realization by the Israelis that the U.S. would slowly but surely, realize that it was bad for it to be supporting Israel because it alienates all those people who have the oil, who are the Arabs, the majority in the Middle East.
And the Persians, yeah.
Slowly,
right.
The U.S. would begin to realize it wasn't really in its interest to continue supporting this Jewish state in the Middle East, and that they would stop doing so. And so what 9/11 did was demonize Israel's enemies in the eyes of the American people, And so I view, going back to my background in the pro-Palestinian movement, they often want to bring in speakers from England and other countries to do tours of Canada or the United States to talk about issues such as, the Palestinian rights in Israel or the lack thereof, issues like that. But, I say, why don't you, our goal is to get North Americans to empathize with the Palestinians, or at least sympathize with the Palestinians. Why don't we bring in speakers who talk about Israeli involvement in 9/11? Because then you can tell North American middle-class people who normally might not give a damn about the Palestinians, you can tell them, look, not only are the Palestinians victims of Zionist terrorism, you were victims of Zionist terrorism on 9/11. And I think 9/11 would be the key to
USS Liberty, too.
Well, and the USS Liberty and other incidents. But I think that, if you could get North American people to realize that they're victims of Zionism, whether it's through lobbying of their politicians or, through the 9/11 false flag attack where 3,000 of their compatriots were killed on 9/11 by Zionists, then you might get the North American people to start to empathize with those victims of Zionist terrorism in the Middle East. And I think that 9/11 can be the key for the pro-Palestinian movement. And so I often have frustrations with the 9/11 truth movement, so-called, who often shy away from the evidence of Israeli involvement in 9/11 because being called a conspiracy theorist is bad enough, but to get called an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist is more than most can handle. But then, likewise, whereas people in the pro-Palestinian movement actually do deal with the vibrant debate that's gone on since the publication of Walter Mearsheimer's book, the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, does the Zionist tail wag the American dog? You have people like Chomsky who say, no, it doesn't. You have people like Finkelstein who say, I'm kind of on the fence. It's a bit of both. And then you have...
Well, Finkelstein's position is you can't tell where one starts, the other stops, because what really is running the show there in the MIC is it's got so much overlap that it's like just one tail, really. That's his thing. I've talked to him at length about that, but continue.
Movement does actually at least deal with that debate, whereas the truth movement, it's like, okay, so we're dealing, because I think the thing we have to remember is that academics who might say, come out and say, oh, I think the U.S. government may have allowed these Islamists to attack themselves on 9/11, like some lie-hop kind of watered-down version of 9/11 skepticism. Within the context of universities, those guys are radicals, right? So people like David Ray Griffin and others are kind of like real radicals in the context of the academy. But when you get into everyday life where you have working-class citizen journalists, actually speaking the whole truth about 9/11, a lot of the so-called leaders of the 9/11 truth movement are actually not that effective. And so I see how the 9/11 truth movement, it deals with Building 7 and has these endless debates about the science of 9/11.
Minutia, they're missing the whole picture. I mean, you've got to look at the Iraq War and the anthrax and everything before and after 9/11, and it's very clear. You cannot just be like, Building 7 fell too fast and wasn't hit by a plane. That just tells you what didn't happen. It doesn't tell you what happened, who did or why, or anything else.
Well, I think you get sincere people who got into this, do-gooders, and they suddenly realize, oh shit, Israel's involved in this.
Watch the four-letter words.
And so you get these people who then just get into endless debates about the science because they know deep down that they're scared to get into talking about Zionism and Israel, because that's really where the 9/11 science leads you. Science is only useful if it's used as evidence to indict those in the political realm who did the false flag attack. When you get into who the neocons were, the preponderance of neocons were Jewish Zionists. They endlessly go on about...
I got the pump music coming, but we're going to wrap it up after this break and talk about the neocons, Zionists, and the joint operation of 9/11 as a false flag between the U.S. factions and Israel against its own people. And we're back. This is the What Really Happened show. I'm Ryan Dawson, subbing for Mike Rivera. The number to call is 800-313-9443. We only have about 3 minutes left. I'm talking to Joshua Blakeney.
Hello?
Oh, hey. I had a little disconnection problem there.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm still here.
Oh, sorry. I was on my end. I just lost all sound and everything. Anyway, we got to wrap things up in 3 minutes. 9/11 is such a beast of a topic. I mean, when people ask me about it, I hate sloganeering, just say inside job, because it wasn't even clearly just the inside. It's in and outside. There's lots of factions involved. It takes me about 3 hours and change to 4 hours to really explain it. I don't like just saying something, and you can't sloganeer something this complicated. So it's why you have to have a conversation. It's why I bring people like Joshua on. So when you start hashing it out, and we could do it chronologically, so we're not going to be able to finish this in the next 2 minutes or so. But if you want to know more about the factual things about 9/11 and not just running in circles about saying the building fell too fast or no building ever fell by fire or just stuff that's just really Class D arguments, not really giving you much at all, then go see War by Deception. Go see 9/11 in the cover-up. Go watch Josh on Press TV. Or do you have some sites you can recommend, Josh, for your own work?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say, Ryan, that, I'd love to collaborate with you in the future, make some YouTubes, and maybe even incorporate you into some of my Press TV reports. I have the function of using, phone interviews in my reports from time to time, and so I'd definitely like to, give you a platform if I'm able to do that, because I think what you're doing is very important, and as I say, I attribute a lot of my analysis to you having the courage early on. I mean, a lot of people, it's kind of like after World War II, a lot of people said,
I got attacked bad when I said that back years and years ago. In 2004, I was throwing in the rock and 9/11 together, and man, I got assaulted from that. Not anymore, though.
I think you and sort of Kevin and people who really pioneered this, I came along a few years later where maybe a few years later these days, talking about Zionism, it's not as taboo as it was probably back then. So I salute your fatigability on that one. But I have a website, joshuablakeney.info. I have a YouTube channel, Globalization 1492 is the name of the YouTube channel. So Globalization 1492, and I also have one called Non-Aligned Media. I just sort of started that recently, but my
Non-Aligned Media.
My main YouTube channel is Globalization 1492. My website is joshuablakeney.info. I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook page and a personal Facebook page that you can look for me. Facebook's banned me from adding friends right now. Apparently they know who I do know and don't know, which is quite interesting. So they decided
well, we'll throw a link to the main one up on WRH right after the show. I'll do that. And so people can know where to find you. And I'd love to come on Press TV or talk at a college or what have you. A little far away, but I can do the collaboration with you anytime. On 9/11 or in the wars or what have you, Syria, etc. It's all one long story, really.
It's endless war and slavery. It's pretty Orwellian.
Yes, it is. Well, that's our show for today. Mike Rivera will be back on Monday. Thanks for being with me. Please call your senators S2372. Support Open Beaches in North Carolina. Support Ron Paul. Support Occupy. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks, Josh.